Well, welcome everyone today. This is Ted Patterson of Critical Path Training. I think we all know why we're here, because we're excited about the Power Platform, all the changes that are coming down the road this fall. Now, what we want to do today is look at flow in the context of working with SharePoint Online. Now, Microsoft Flow does some pretty neat things. Maybe just a quick intro. Let's go ahead and move back over here into my slide deck right here. Not my slide deck, but over here. And what we're able to do is we're able to create flows through what I'm going to call the Flow portal. If you go to flow.microsoft.com, it will resolve to a slightly different URL, typically that has some type of geographic designator like US. And this is what we kind of consider the Flow portal. Note that if I move over to the Power Apps portal, once again, these are not official names by Microsoft. These are kind of names that I've given them. I can look at flows and note that, I can move back and forth between my different environments, and see the different flows inside there. One of the things that I would recommend is that you continue to use the Flow portal, just because there's plenty of features that are missing if you try to create and work with them from in the Power Apps portal. But you can see there's a lot of work to begin integrating all the Power Platform pieces, into a single user experience so that we're not going to spread across multiple portals. Also note that when we work with Flow, we're creating these things that live somewhere, and where they live is inside an environment. So what we've been doing for the last couple years is that when we work with Flow, we have something which is called the Power Apps Admin Center. And if I go there, I can see my environments. Note that there's this one special environment that you don't create. It was already created when you create your tenant, and that's what we call the default environment. And there's a couple things that are very specific about integrating Flow with SharePoint Online that require you to build a flow in the default environment. And we're going to see one of those demos. Note that Microsoft has a future direction to kind of move all the admin work into something else, which is called the Power Platform Admin Center. So for instance, I can go to the Power Platform Admin Center, which is admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. That's where we're going, but that's not quite where we are yet. If I look at environments, I can see the environments there. If I want to create an environment, basically says coming soon. So you can see that, as we move forward, you definitely want to start looking at the Power Platform Admin Center. For instance, if I go to a particular environment, and then we go ahead and we look at something like the settings, this gives me the drill down, for Power Apps administrators as well as Dynamics 365 administrators. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of take a quick tour around there. Somehow I landed up on my website, a subliminal plug for our different training courses, including the one that I think you should take, which a lot of the content that I'm going to present today in this webinar and a lot of the demos are from lab exercises I built for this course, building business solutions with Power Apps and Flow. Okay, now the first thing that we want to look at is just kind of the big picture of customizing SharePoint with the Power Platform. Now, in sections 2 through 5, we'll look specifically at Flow. But here, let's kind of see some of the other things that we could do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to SharePoint. And we have a customers list. And with this particular customers list, I created it from the custom list type. And then I added standard SharePoint site columns, such as first name, company, email. And the idea is that I could now create a list item added inside here. Note that SharePoint has really moved away from some of the old classic SharePoint lists, like the contacts list type. So to get the best level of flow integration, you just want to create a list from the custom list type and then add either your own site columns or what I've done out of the box site columns, to give yourself what you want. But what you'll find is things like the older contacts list had too much baggage to really move ahead to the modern UI and to the better integration, that we have. And note that if you don't see the Power Apps and Flow menus, by a SharePoint list, it's still using the older UI. Now, what I want to show in this first example, once again, I kind of go back to our training course. This is an app, a Canvas app that the students build on the first day. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of move over here and take a look at this one particular app. And so as I open up this app, I won't even open up an edit view, but the idea, it's a custom ordering app. It's got a couple different screens. So we can browse to a particular browse customer screen. No customers yet. Now, I've also integrated a custom connector so that the Power App can call out to a external web service and grab some content and save it inside there. And so what I want to do here is just kind of add a couple different list items inside. Okay, now that I've done that, let's go back to our SharePoint site. Let's go back to the home page, and here is that exact same Canvas app that I built with Power Apps with a custom connector behind it. And instead of making, our users, go through this typical SharePoint view, maybe we would find it more productive, by starting to use Power Apps, by starting to use kind of all the productivity features that we get from Power Apps, to be able to go, and add our new customers through here, so that now we basically have a easier user interface. So between Canvas apps and custom connectors and what we're about to drill into, building flows, there's really a, very open canvas for you to start thinking about, how you can extend SharePoint with SharePoint lists and SharePoint document libraries. Okay, so enough of this high-level discussion. Let's get back, to the agenda. So what we want to do is go through some specific scenarios. So I have 4 flows that I want to demonstrate, over this next hour. So the first one is importing data into a SharePoint list. So let's say we have some type of a external web service. Now, it just so happens that I have an external web service that we use inside of our training classes, and we've removed any type of security, just to be able to focus on the data that's moving back and forth. So note that if I call this web service right here, I can get back a list of customers. If I include something, such as a open paren, and then we have a particular number, we can get a specific customer inside there. So let's go ahead and kind of see how we can build a flow that's going to call into this. Now, I'm going to go back into flow. I'm going to go back to the environment, where I have my demos inside here, and look at this one, which is called the Add New Customer into SharePoint. Now, when we look at this, this is a flow that is built using a trigger. Now, let's just kind of go through a couple more conceptual slides about flow, just because I've introduced it here. Some of you might be brand new to working with flow. So the idea of flow is that you have triggers. The trigger is the first step, the first block that you see in the designer, but it's also the thing that starts the flow in motion. You have actions, and those are typically parameterized little tasks that you want to have performed. And then you have the services. Think of the places that you're reading data from and the places you're writing data to. And the beauty of working with Canvas apps and flows is that there are just a ton of connectors, 250 some odd connectors that someone has written to easily connect your Canvas apps and your flows to things like this custom web service, and in our particular case, SharePoint. Now, when it comes to flow triggers, we have 3 different types. So one is you have a flow that runs, at a periodic interval, once a day, once an hour, once a minute. You can also have flows that run in response to something happening, such as someone adding a SharePoint list item or a Dynamics 365 contact. And for these demos, I'm just going to kind of keep the trigger simple. And so I just have a button that we're going to push, inside of Microsoft Flow to start the flow running. Now, as you start building flows, there's all these different actions. If you use Flow for the next couple of years, you will use and get comfortable with hundreds, if not thousands, of different action types. But there's the core actions that you really have to kind of understand just to get up and going. So for instance, there's control of flow actions for if-then loops, for apply to each, which is kind of like our for each loop. We also have variables. So if you want to have some type of a counter, or you want to have some kind of state machine that lives throughout the lifetime of a flow as it runs, possibly over several days or weeks, you can create a variable. And there's actions both to initialize the variable and to set values. And then there's data operations. So we're going to look at quite a few data operations in this hour. So if I look at the data operations, compose, create, HTML table, join, parse JSON, select, we're going to look at all those in the demos that are ahead. Okay, now in our case right here, let's say that we have this custom web service, and the problem with the custom web service is that no one really thought it was significant enough to build a connector into Flow. But still, I want to go out and I want to be able to call into that. Now, the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use this thing which is called the HTTP action. The HTTP action will basically call across the network with an HTTP request. Now, let's go back and kind of drill down. So I have this particular flow right here. Now, another thing about flows is once you create them, you can go ahead and test them inside here. Now, let me go ahead and run and test the flow. And so one of the things that's nice is that it just gives you, while you're building out a flow, a very easy way to execute it. Let's go ahead and run this flow right here. And sometimes you test the flow before you're anywhere close to finishing it because you want to see if you're acquiring the data the proper way. You want to see what format the data's in. Oh, so I clicked on this. Okay, and now the flow went ahead and ran. So here's an example where I use a flow function called ran to create a random number, and then we're going to use the compose function so that we can basically take that random number, and put it into our URL. Okay, and then what we have is we're using the HTTP action to call across the network. And now here's what the data looks like when it comes back. Okay, here's where Flow kind of says, I'm really not a tool, that doesn't require any developer knowledge. So I think when you compare Canvas apps to Power BI to Flow, Flow's the one area where you just kind of drop down, into these areas, that really require that things like JSON and HTTP request response pairs. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this JSON and we're going to create an object out of it. So there is something which is called Parse JSON. Now, the way that Parse JSON works is that it takes the JSON from this previous action and it puts it through a transform. Now, note that if I go back here, and I grab this JSON, and there's lots of different ways that you could get it, whether you wanted to use something like Reflector, or not Reflector, but Fiddler or Postman. But the idea is once you get the raw JSON, what we're able to do is say, use sample, generate payload, and it takes a little time to kind of get used to that, but now what you have when this comes down is now we can add the SharePoint create item, and all that data, that we brought back from the web service, is now freely available to us. Okay. Now, let's say that we go back here and we're kind of looking at our SharePoint list. There are a couple different customers. Let's now go back to our flows. If you're new to Flow, there's this really obnoxious aspect of the editor. When you've saved everything and you leave, it makes you paranoid because it says, are you sure you want to save everything? Okay, now make sure you saved everything, but once you have made sure you've saved everything, don't worry about this dialog because it comes up unnecessarily. So what we want to do is we want to add this new customer. Let's go ahead and click OK. And so now here's just kind of an example of running the flow. Once I run the flow, can we go back to SharePoint? Can I take my Canvas app? Can I refresh the Canvas app and, see the new things that we built? And the answer is, yes, we can. If I go back, to my flow after it's done, another thing that we should really get comfortable with is taking a flow as you're building it out, clicking on it, going to its summary page and seeing the flow runs and being able to kind of see the flow runs. Notice that they call out when you've kind of executed it through the test mechanism in the editor versus when you kind of run the flow live. If I now drill down into the history of the flow, we can see all kinds of things, such as what did the data look like when it came back from the HTTP call, and what was the data that we fed in, when we wanted to add these, in as SharePoint list items. Okay, so once again, you kind of see that the HTTP action is this wildcard. So if you can't connect to it through one of the standard connectors, well, you can create a custom connector. It's a more complicated story for a different webinar, or you can use the HTTP action. And once you use the HTTP action and you've basically harvested a result, which is JSON, using the Parse JSON, then allows you to, freely take that data and do something such as add it to a customer list. Okay, so now you've seen the first flow demo, importing SharePoint content from an external web service. Now, the next thing we want to do is look at a very practical way to use flow. So let's say that I have this huge SharePoint list, and I have 10 or 20 different users that are just pounding on data entry screens, adding data inside there. And as much as I tried, I just couldn't find kind of the SharePoint way to add validation. So what I want to do is once a day, I want to run an operation across the SharePoint list and have my flow automatically enumerate item by item through that list and perform, some type of a cleanup operation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a apply to each. Now let's do this kind of as a hands-on demo. So I'm going to go back to flow, and let's go ahead and say I want a new flow. Give me instant, which means give me the button to click on. And what will this be called? And I'll just call this Ted's demo, and I'll pick the flow button, and we'll go ahead and choose create. Okay, so now I have a flow that I can easily trigger. What are we going to do? So let's first come up and notice that when you add actions, I'm going to say get get items SharePoint. So being able to type something in so that you can quickly filter through the different actions, gets to be important. In our case right here, we'll go ahead and point to that SharePoint site. We'll point to that customers list. Okay. And so now that we've done that and we've got all the items, let's go ahead and save. And once again, just kind of let me point out that one thing that I'm very fond of is, just kind of testing regularly as you're building the flow. I'm not doing anything with the items yet, but let's see, what they look like. So we'll go ahead and we'll build the flow. We'll go ahead and run the flow in the test environment. Let's go ahead and run that. And then your flow runs successfully. Let's go down here and kind of look at the output. Note that when they give you the output, you have this output of this action that has a value property, and that value property, basically contains an array of items which are the customer list items. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to enumerate through this particular array, and we're going to use a for each loop to be able to do that. So back here, we'll go ahead and add a new step, and this will be apply to each. Once we've added the apply to each, it says select the output, and so the value property of get items, basically think of it as an array of flow objects that represent SharePoint customer list items. And now I get to do something for each and every one of these. So what we're going to say is we're going to say get, or not get, but we're going to say update SharePoint item. And when I say update SharePoint item, well, down here is my update item. That's great. And so now it basically asks me to put in some information. So I'm going to basically point to that same site. I'm going to point to that same list. And now what is the ID? Now, if all you want to do is kind of take the data that is in the item and blindly transfer it, like I'm going to do here, that's easy to do. Now, note that when you have a SharePoint list item, you have to add the ID because you have to tell it what item you want to update. And for various reasons, they also make you update one field, which is the title site column. Note that if I go back to my SharePoint site and I look at customers, What's interesting about the last item is that underneath that, it's really the classic SharePoint title site column. It's the one that has the drop-down menu. So for various reasons, even if you're not going to change its value, you have to write into that. So I'm going to go back here. We're going to find last name. We're going to write inside there. And if I don't write anything else, any of the other column values will be left to their default. Now, here's what we want to do. We want to take the company name, and the company name currently is not specially cased. And let's say I work in this law firm, and we have this rule that all company names have to be bounced to uppercase. And our users continually forget to do that. So we want to just create a flow that we run once a day that automatically bounces these to uppercase. Okay, now the problem with this, let's go back here, is that if I go down here and take company, hey, that's great, but I haven't done anything with it. For me to really do a transform, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go over to where it says expressions, and I'm going to have to write a flow expression. And what I would say is that when you're working in text boxes over here on the left, that's kid stuff. You just type like you usually do. When you're over here in the expressions text box, all of a sudden you come into this world of workflow definition language and a very strict set of syntax rules. Okay, now, if I start having to build expressions like we're going to have to in this case, you have to know some things about this underlying language, workflow definition language, and it was built for true developers because it was built for logic apps in Azure, and then the exact same language was, made to work for Flow. And as you know, Flow, Microsoft doesn't position that as a tool that requires developers. So what they're trying to do is kind of hide places where we have to, write the WDL, but here's the case where I got to write the WDL. How do I do that? So once you start writing expressions, what you're going to find is that you can never use double quotes. That will cause a syntax error. Single quotes is a way to create a quote. Note that if you try to use the plus sign or the ampersand to parse things together, it doesn't work because the language doesn't support those. Instead, you have to use a function called concat and basically pass either 2 or 3 or 4 arguments. So now you're starting to get this feeling that, WDL, don't underestimate it. And so in our case right here, let's say I wanted to get that value. And in our case, I really didn't have to worry about the WDL because the environment just let me drag and drop. But now is this case where I have to use one of the expressions that's built into the Flow language. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to use this special function which is called item. Now let's go back over here. And so notice that when I type inside there, they give me IntelliSense. I want to use the toUpper function. And there is this tooltips that pops up that is completely annoying. But now what we're going to do is we're going to use item. So once again, item is a function, and it basically just allows you to reference what is the current item, in this particular iteration, through the enumeration process. Now, inside of the square brackets, in single quotes, not double quotes, then, we have the name, which in our case, make sure you spell it correctly, is company. Let's go ahead, choose OK. And so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and hit save. Now that we've hit save, let's go ahead and go back to our flows right here. And let's look at the before picture. Great. Let's now go back and take my flow. Let's go ahead and execute that right here. And so, now that we've executed that right here, what we could do is we can go back here and let's go ahead and do a quick refresh. And we can see everything has bounced to uppercase. Maybe taking this one more step, let's go back here and let's take the trigger. Let's go ahead and delete the trigger. And once again, a flow is useless without a trigger. So when you remove the trigger from an existing flow, the first thing you have to do is add another trigger inside there. But now I could use schedule, and there's something called recurrence. And so now, if I want to run this, once a day and, look at some of the advanced options inside there, setting time zones and stuff, I can basically just now set it and forget it and have this logic run on a periodic basis, just to basically move through large lists and make sure, the data is left in a valid state. Okay, so now you've seen that. Let's keep going through here. We've got 2 more exciting demos ahead of us, but at some point today, I wanted to dive in and talk about writing expressions. And just remember that things are easy with the syntax when you're on the actual actions and their cards and you're typing inside there. But once you move into that expression text box, you really have to know your stuff, to make sure that the expressions you write are going to do what you want them to do and not cause errors. Okay. Next thing we're going to do, this is exciting, is we're going to parse some SharePoint content, from a list, into HTML. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to look at this thing called the select action. Now, just to give you an example, let's go back to my flows, and let's go back to this flow, which is called send email incorrectly spelled containing HTML table with customer. Okay, so let's go ahead and open that up. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to call get customers, and we're going to go get all those customer records inside there. Now, let's look at this thing called select. So the idea of select is that I can take this array, which is basically the value property of the get items action, and while they give me a certain set of particular fields or columns, I might want something a little bit different. So the idea is then I can map a new set of columns. And so what we're doing here is we're basically saying first name, last name, and we're going to build some HTML. So now I built 3 different columns, one of which has some sophisticated HTML. Now, let's go ahead and run this flow. And as I run the flow, basically the purpose of this flow is to go through the customer list and take a certain number of customers and basically send out, some type of a mail message to some of our salespeople. So now you have your list of customers or leads that you need to contact for the day. Okay, now I've just run that flow. So back here, let's go ahead and take a look at what comes out of get items. When I see what comes out of get items, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but that's not what I want to use to build an HTML table. So when I have the select, that is my input, but now look, what is my output? Now I have a very nice array of objects that only have a first name, last name, and email. Now, one reason we might like to use that is we have something which is called create HTML table. Now, if I go back here into edit mode, once we've done the select, we're simply going to take that output of select, because now I have 3 columns just the way I want them, and I'm going to use a data operation or a data action called create HTML table. And so this puts out content right here. Now, what I want to do here is I want to kind of make a point of, let's go through, and I want to get rid of that just for a second. And I want to go back here to create HTML table, and let me get the demo right. Let's go ahead and hit save. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And what you can see is that, we have an email down here, which is basically going to create HTML. And what is the output? The body is just, created up here in this compose statement inside. Now, if I go back here and actually, before I do that, let me execute this flow one more time. So I had the flow working, and I intentionally have broken it for a second to make a key point. So I go ahead and I run this right here. And so what I've done is I've created the HTML table, and now I've just kind of passed it, into a function here where we're just kind of taking the HTML table and putting that inside. But now here's the problem. I come back here, and it didn't really include them, as HTML tags, because HTML table has this HTML encoding process. Basically what it will do is it will take an angle bracket that looks like that and change it into an encoded one, So instead of being treated as an HTML syntax element, it's just basically shown, as the less than sign inside there. So what we need to do, to make this one work is let's go back into edit mode. And so now we're going to decode the HTML content, by basically, here is a piece of IDL. When you look at the experience of, editing, all you got to do is bring up Notepad and your editing experience is already 1,000,000 times better. Okay, great that there's room for improvement. But the idea is that HTML table is going to take, this character and switch it to this character. So we're just going to change them back. And there's only 3 characters that we have to change back, but once we have done that inside here, let's go back here, and now we're going to add the decode HTML element inside there. And Ted keeps putting it in the wrong place. One more time. Let's go ahead and hit save. Now that we've hit save inside there, let's go ahead and test our work one more time. And so now what we've been able to do, let's go back here, is kind of get rid of the problem with the HTML encoding, and now go back to something where someone has a nice list. Now, let's say that there's this guy, Buster Freeman, and I have a salesperson and I want the salesperson to contact Buster. So what I want is a scenario where the salesperson can simply hover over this link, click on it, and it will automatically generate this beginning message. So how do we achieve that effect? So back here, one of the things that I'm really big on is using compose actions so that you don't have actions that are doing 1,000,000 things at once. If you need to parse together an HTML path or a document or a URL or lots of different things, just putting them in their own separate compose statement is going to make your flow so much more readable and so much more easy to maintain. So here's the customer message. It was nice to have you, great. Now, down here in the HTML table creation, let's go ahead and, I'm sorry, it's not in there, it's in the select statement down here. We basically have an href, mail to, and then we're going to have subject getting together. If I look back here, you can kind of see that, I put the subject inside here of getting together. I want to say hi, I want to list that particular customer's name. So notice that as I put this together, I can pull first name or any element, from that SharePoint list data, into, the text as I'm parsing together these HTML tags inside there. And so, once again, just giving you a nice productivity app so that someone's able just to kind of walk up to one of these, click on that, and all of a sudden they're up and running, being able to kind of send email messages out much faster than they would have, had they used some other way. Okay, so let's see where we are back in the slides here. So one of the things that, I wanted to come across there is that you work with a service like SharePoint or Azure SQL or the Common Data Service, and they hand you data. Sometimes the data is not in the shape that you want it. So being able to use the select action, to kind of quickly transform things. Note that I used it, in one particular mode. Let's go back here. And if I kind of click on this right here, switch to text mode, switch to key value mode. So the idea is if you're in text mode, you're just basically creating a single element array output. If you are in key value mode, you're basically kind of creating a table. So working in key value mode, works out pretty well when you then want to take what you've created and pass it directly to the HTML table action. Okay. Now, since you've seen that, seen how to create an HTML table, let's go ahead and kind of work through the last thing that we're going to look at here. So we're going to look at automating the generation of Word documents, and this is something that involves the Word Online connector, which is new. It's in preview. but it can be used either to take an HTML or a Word document template and basically take content from a SharePoint list and parse in content into placeholders, or we can also take a docx file and convert it into a PDF file. Now, there's this special trigger that we're going to see, which is called the custom action for a selected item. Now, let's say I go back to the SharePoint list. I'm going to go back to the SharePoint list. Once I go to that SharePoint list, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick a particular item. And once you've set this up, the effect that you're going to get is that there, is the flow that you want to execute. And not only can you execute the flow, but you can execute the flow and automatically pass it the SharePoint list item. So that flow can basically use any of the data in that SharePoint list item to do what it wants to do. Now, there are two ways that you can create this type of trigger. One way is that if you go back here into flows, and now I'm going to say new, and I'm going to say new instant from blank, and then I'll just say skip this form and let me kind of start from scratch. So if I say SharePoint for a selected item, you can basically use this approach. I would recommend using better spelling than Ted is using right here. But the idea is that once we get that SharePoint operation for a selected item, I can point to a SharePoint list. Now here's the gotcha. I lost half a day because of this one time. This only works if your flow is created inside of the default environment. If you put it in any other default environment, it won't fail, but it won't work. So either you navigate here, to the default environment, and you create it from here, or another thing that's a little bit more foolproof is just to create it starting in SharePoint. Okay, so I have one which is called generate letter for customer. Let's create it again. So we'll come back here, and I'm at the customers list, and here I'll say create a flow. When I say create a flow, now I see a couple different flows or templates for flows, none of what I want. I click on show more. I go all the way to the bottom, and here we are, complete a custom action for the selected item. So the idea is it will create a flow, and it will set up the trigger and pass you the SharePoint list item, and all you got to do is decide what to do with that information in a flow that's already executing. So let's go ahead and add that inside there. Now, it basically tells me I need to grant my approval so that this flow can use this. And note that when you create this, it doesn't just give you a trigger for a selected item. It gives you a get item action as well. And the issue is that a lot of times when they create triggers, they want them to be efficient so the trigger doesn't automatically pass every single column in that SharePoint list item. If you want kind of a deep dive, into the content for that SharePoint list item, you then have to take the ID that's passed from the trigger and use that to get the item. And they've already set that stuff up for me. Okay, so let's go ahead and change this. Ted's new command. And what's important about the title, is that this will be what the user sees in SharePoint. Ted's new command for letter creation. Now, next thing that we're going to do is we are going to look for Word Online. Once I get to Word Online, there's populate a Microsoft Word document template. Okay, so first of all, I need a template. Now here, we have to do a little bit of a tangent. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, on my machine, and I'm going to look at this Word document that I built, which is called Customer Letter Template. Now, if you want to work with this format, you got to know something about kind of the developer side of docx files. And I remember doing some training for Microsoft and covering these things 10 years ago. So these things are not new. Now, the first thing to know is that if you want to use these, you have to choose Customize the Ribbon, and you have to make sure that this thing, which is the Developer tab, is automatically selected. Okay, and it won't be by default. So once you add that, then you have this thing, which is the Developer tab. Now, let's say that I wanted to add a placeholder. Once the Developer tab is there, I go over here, and there are these things that are called content controls. Let's add a content control. Okay, now another very important piece of information is that there are lots of content controls whose types are not supported. So the rules here are just like creating Word templates for Dynamics 365, and that is you can use the plain text control, you can use the picture content control, and you can use the repeater control. Okay, and none of the other content controls, are supported. The other thing that's a little bit strange about this is, once you've created one of these, you need to bring up the property sheet. So you select the property sheet, and once you select the property sheet, you can put in a title, and now this becomes the string name that you use to identify it when you want it right inside there. Okay, so once again, I've created something here. Let me kind of roll back all my changes, where I have a mailing address, I have a date, I have where we're going to put the letter content, and who the letter is from. Okay, so what we've done is I've basically taken that template, and if now we go back to SharePoint and we go to letters, here's where we want to create our letters. But if I go into templates, I had to put this somewhere where Flow can find it. So leaving the template on my C drive is not a very satisfying endpoint for Flow to be able to reach. So we've basically just created a templates folder inside of a regular SharePoint document library, and we've added this inside. Okay, now back here, I want to publish a document template, and so we're going to go ahead and pick Ted's demo site. Great. Down here, I'll pick letters, and now it gives me the ability to kind of use this ability to go into templates to find that Word template, and now we're going to count 1, 2. I was pretty quick. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 seconds. But now, what we're able to do is you're able to see those name placeholders that you've created, inside of your Word document. Okay, because I'm lazy, I wanted to write a WLDL expression, but all of you gave me stage fright, so I chickened out. But now we want the date. So here, it's pretty easy to, get a date inside of Flow, but then to localize it for your time zone and put it in the format that you want, that can be a little bit trickier. So here's an example of a particular flow right here, maybe easier to see. Convert time zone, UTC now. Let's say that's my time zone, Eastern Standard. Here's the format, of the date that I want inside there. Okay, now for the mailing address. So here's what's really neat is that we have the for a selected item, we have get item, and so all that information from the SharePoint list, is available to me. Let's go ahead and find our first name. And now what we're going to do is we're going to work not in the expressions box. Hooray for that. We're over on the right-hand side. So now it's just put in one of these particular values, put in a space, and now down here we'll basically pull last name. Okay. How do I get a line break? Oh, you hit the enter key. Hey, that's pretty easy. Let's go ahead and hit address. And there is something that's a little bit annoying is that every time you add a field, you have to kind of click the cursor back inside here. But now we have the city, comma. We'll go ahead and, parse in state. Some other guys, creating some type of C# web application trying to keep up with me. I'm a million times faster than that guy, as I'm building this out inside here. And let's go ahead and add the zip code. And now that we've got that, let's go ahead and add the letter content. Okay, so let's not put the letter content into this action. Let's go up here. Let's go ahead and add a compose. So now we'll go ahead and add a compose inside there, and let's give it a name to make it a little bit more readable. So compose letter content. And so now that we've done that, we'll basically say something such as hi, and we'll go ahead and have a very friendly greeting to our user. We'll use first name, and now we want to add some more content inside here. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a little quick cheating here. I have a lab exercise that we have in our class just to make it a little bit more fun. I'm going to go ahead and kind of grab a little bit more content and add this inside. Okay, and so now that we've done that, let's kind of end up by coming back here. We want the letter content inside, and so there's the output of my compose. And then for the letter author, if I go back to that first step, which is the trigger, what you're going to see is that the for a selected item, has the username. What is the user that selected the item? That's who we're going to assign the letter as. Okay, so now let's go ahead and hit save. And so now that we've hit save inside there, let's go back and test things out. So back here, we look at our letters, and what we'll see is we have a document library we're going to add letters into. Well, now my user goes back to the SharePoint list, and let's go ahead and take a, what's the best name that we have inside here? How about Tyrone Cherry? That's a pretty good one. If I come back here and drop this down, what we see is that there's Ted's new command. So now you've basically kind of created a flow that automatically gets triggered. Note that if you have two items selected, it don't work. So you have to make sure only one item is selected. The other thing that's a little bit strange about this is that, when the flow, sometimes a little bit finicky, looks like I have to kind of go off the page and back on it, before it's going to work correctly. And it sometimes takes a second or two before you get that inside there. Note that I can also get to the exact same thing by going to the drop-down menu, going to flow, and we should see them there too. So let's go ahead and run this particular command. And now that we've run the command inside here, we'll go ahead and choose continue. And we'll go ahead and run this flow. And now that we have run the flow, let me also point out that I like to say that I intentionally made an error here. I actually made it by mistake, but it's a very common error. And that is, nothing went wrong. I look back here, and where's my letter? And it's not there. So the one extra action we have to do is to actually save the file. So this Word Online action will create the file, but just in memory. It doesn't know to put it in SharePoint versus OneDrive. So what we now have to do is kind of finish up with a create file. Once we add a SharePoint create file inside there, what we're going to be able to do, is take that PDF file, or I'm sorry, that Word document. So now, where are we going to look at? My SharePoint site. What is the document library? It is letters. What is the, name of the file? So here, if it wasn't a simple demo, I'd probably put this in a separate compose statement. But we'll say letter. We'll go ahead and take the first name. I'll take the last name. In some scenarios, I might put date in or something else to, make sure it's unique if I create many letters for the same customer in the same day. But once again, it's just a demo. And now we'll say docx. And then finally, where's the file content? So once again, this action, populated Microsoft Word template, creates the content, just doesn't do anything with it. Let's go ahead and hit save. And so now that we have done that, now we should be able to run through the demo where we go back here And once again, we'll go to our target customer, Tyrone Cherry, and the name was created randomly. Let's go ahead and pick our command inside there. Let's go ahead and run the flow. And now, as that flow runs, we should be able to go back a little bit later. And hey, there's this new letter, created a minute ago. I go ahead and I open that up. And now kind of what we've seen here, is that, it's automatically able to generate the Word document just by grabbing data inside of a SharePoint list. Okay, the Word Online connector, remember, is still in preview. One of the things that I'd like to see that isn't supported yet is you can take a Word document and convert it to a PDF file, but the Word document has to already exist. So we need a couple more features before I can dynamically create a Word document and then take that file name and pass it to the other action that kind of PDF-arizes the Word document, and saves it back for you. But once again, there's a lot of really great scenarios that open up, once we have that inside there. Okay, so we looked at quite a few different things inside there today. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go down and kind of address some of the questions that have been asked. If you have other questions, please feel free to add them inside there. Okay. Let's see. Is the HTTP connector considered premium? And the answer is absolutely. So another thing I should point out is that Microsoft made a couple of preliminary announcements about licensing changes to Power Apps and Flow that began on October 1st. We're still waiting for another email that's going to nail down a lot more of the specifics. One of the big changes that we see is that what used to be very expensive, which is building model-driven apps and common data service built solutions, used to be $40 per person as a minimum, and now they have a per app where it's dropping down to 25% of that. So you'll be able to build model-driven apps and work with the common data service and basically serve up an application to users for $10 a month. So that really makes model-driven apps and CDS development a lot more economically feasible, where over the last 2 years I saw many companies just take a look at it and say, no thanks, too expensive. Things like the HTTP connector were updated as far as their licensing last year, at the end of last year. And while at first you were able to just get by on your Office 365 licenses to use premium connectors like the HTTP connector, once we basically had those changes last November, the HTTP connector, was now not something that, was paid for by your Office 365 license. So you needed a Power Apps Plan 1 or Plan 2 license. But I should have a whole webinar on licensing because we basically are doing away with Power Apps P1 and P2. And we're now going to per app and per user. One great benefit is that of all the licensing changes, the best one is for developers. Developers need no more licensing. All licensing is based on actual usage. So it used to be you had to pay $40 a month just to build things on the common data service. And so obviously Microsoft's strategy is let's make it free for people to learn how to build all this stuff. And the more stuff that gets built, the more usage we'll have, the more money we'll make off the usage model. Okay, but once again, many companies should really do the due diligence to kind of look at the licensing announcements when they come out, because it might affect what you're paying right now. It might open the door to use things that you might have thought were, costly, prohibitive. Another great option for you, and for me, would be for, you to check out Critical Path Training, and at Critical Path Training, navigate to that one particular place, which is building business solutions with Power Apps and Flow. So all the demos I showed today are just kind of out of the lab track of the hands-on lab exercises in this course. Note that, if a 3-day training course seems a little bit too much for you, we also have day of courses, a day of building business solutions with Power Apps and a day of building business solutions with Flow, which you could take remotely. So it might be easier, to kind of get started with those. I'd like to thank everyone for their time, their interest in critical path training. Check out our website, check out some of our hands-on training, and feel free to interact with us. Send us email at info@criticalpathtraining.com.